Hello, and welcome to the Brave New Weed podcast. And now, here's your host, Joe Dolce.
Welcome to the 420 edition of the Brave New Weed podcast. This is our 420 2020 edition. And it's a weird time, right, Matthew?
It's definitely a weird time. I think that's the understatement of the month so far.
It certainly is. It's particularly weird for me today. So this is early. It's April 11th. We're recording this. So we're recording early for 420. But we have a special thing to bring you listeners. But I think it's weird because holidays are wistful times. Like I was thinking about where I was last year at 420. I happened to be in San Francisco, and it was the first time I was in San Francisco for 420. Have you ever been there for 420, Matt?
For 420, I have not, but I am a fan of the city in general.
It is like a national holiday there. I mean, there are parades, there are floats, there are people just everywhere in the streets celebrating in all forms of merriment that you can imagine. And it sort of blew me away. I remember taking a walk through Golden Gate Park. As a matter of fact, I spent the day walking from one end to the other. And it was incredibly delightful the entire time. And today I'm like you. So you're in lockdown in Germany, correct?
That is correct.
And when you define lockdown for me, like how often do you go outside?
So according to the official rules, we're allowed to travel for necessary things, and you're allowed a little bit of exercise. So I leave the house like once or twice a day. I force myself to go out and at least take a walk around the block. I got a little park that's across the street from me that I can take a walk around. And then like groceries, right? But other than that, that's it. There's nowhere else to really go and nothing else to really go and do. So rest of the time, you're kind of just indoors.
So I have it better than that because I'm in Tucson for the month, where it's in the 80s and where I'm surrounded by desert. And I have a bicycle and I can take a bicycle ride for, I can go 20 to 30 miles on this path and not really stop or not see anybody or stop at a bird sanctuary. So I'm very lucky. But you're alone. You're spending time alone.
Oh, certainly.
And there's not a lot of community, right? So one of the things you really have to give up right now is sharing. Really sharing everything, right? Like, sharing time, sharing airspace. Mm-hmm. Certainly, I mean, sex. I can't even. I mean, I don't know what to do. Well. What do we do about sex? We're single. I mean, it's really confusing, right?
Yeah,
it's not really. It's you got. You're the best thing you can do is stay home. It's a hard human behavior has changed so dramatically. So I was walking in this bird sanctuary the other day. I was quite high, actually. I smoked a big blunt because I just really needed to. It felt like the end of an endless week. And I smoked up and I went on my bike and in this bird sanctuary, and there was like 3 other people there, and this woman was walking down the path ahead of me. And I realized I moved about 12 feet on the opposite side of the path to avoid her. And I sort of had this vision that I was in a science fiction movie, that coming into contact, into range with people was a scary and bad thing, which in fact it is. And it just struck me that this is the exact opposite of all human behavior that we've ever known. Was that a stoned observation, Matthew?
No, I mean, maybe
I'm sitting here listening to myself and I'm going, you must have been really wrecked.
No, it is one of those things that these, this time and this space apart from each other, it just sort of clears way for thoughts like that, which I think is something, when you say, is that a stoned observation? Whenever we make that sort of joke, I think what we're talking about is like using cannabis to remove those blockages of an idea like that coming forward, right?
I think so, yeah.
And in this time and now to where we're not just constantly bombarded with our social interactions or running around to do shopping or whatever it is, it's another way that those thoughts that are bubbling around in the back of our minds, that lizard brain, right? That pre-evolved uncensored thought can leap out because there's time and there's space for it. And so I think that that's what that is. It's just like, wow, this is a whole unprecedented thing that we've never done before. And now what does that mean? What does that mean for the new normal?
It's a new etiquette. I mean, I was thinking the other day, again, on my own, restaurants, the idea of a crowded, intimate dinner, or I should say an intimate dinner in a crowded restaurant at a small table, cheek by jowl with other people. That's going to be tough that's not going to come around for a long time. I went to, I saw some people the other day, we were all in our masks, and I realized, well, you can't smile and say hello. You have to do this thing called, have you heard of smizing?
Yeah, sure.
Smiling with your eyes. You have to do that, or you have to wink. I mean, these are just really banal and basic thoughts, and good God, think about what it would be like to be living in a tiny apartment or a tiny room with a family, and how difficult that might be. And there's a million. Your mind can go in all sorts of directions about how difficult life can be or how challenging it can be. And yes, it certainly has, and it certainly does.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay, so that I just wanted to sort of talk about that a bit because it is striking all of us. Listen, it's striking the entire world. We know this, which is not exactly solace, but it does make us feel that we are one lump of humanity at this point, all going through something similar in different ways, with different ineptitudes of government leading the way. I would assume you don't feel that in Germany. I mean, I'm assuming you feel that the government is doing a good job of protecting citizens. What do you feel?
I honestly have not had the concerns. Like, I look at the news and I see what's going on in the United States, and I'm happy that I'm not there. I talk to my friends in New York City, and I'm super happy that I'm not there. And maybe it's just a naivety because I'm not like hyper informed as to what's going on around me. But yeah, as far as the organization and the operations of day to day, like we're definitely not making the news every day about some crazy shit going down. You know what I mean?
Yes, I do know. I do know that. And I'm a little jealous, to tell you the truth, because the ineptitude here is I think, terrifying and very disheartening. It makes you feel like the pillars of the society are really shaky right now. And I don't think I'm alone in thinking that. One thing I want to say, though, is I worked with Dr. Chin this week to produce a document on COVID and cannabis that we're going to send to people who are subscribers to Medical Cannabis Mentor and our clients as well. And there were a couple of points she brought up, and I just want to share them before we dig into this great episode, which is one, obviously sharing everything is out. Okay, so you're not sharing pipes, you're not sharing joints, you're not sharing a bong. Okay, and if you are vaporizing, you better be doing it outside, and you better make sure that that cloud of vapor is going nowhere near anybody else. So if you're even thinking about walking down the street vaporizing, you better make sure there's nobody behind you. Right? Very good idea, I think. If you must smoke, well, inhalation is deemed not a great idea because you're irritating the lungs on some level. This is also true, by the way, for dust or being near noxious odors. You want to avoid that stuff. You just want to keep those lungs as clear as possible. But sometimes people don't have access to vaporizers, and they do want to smoke, and there's good reasons to smoke for all sorts of stress or anxiety relief. If you must, use a bong, put water in the bong, clean the bong, obviously, put water in, and put some ice in it to keep the smoke cooler. That will be less irritating to the lungs. And I thought it was also great advice. The other thing she said is really important to do is exercise, because exercise helps keep the lymph fluid flowing through the body, which also keeps the immune response higher. We want to keep our immune systems as, let's say, animated or as supportive as they possibly can be. So if anything does strike, you can fight it with the full force of your immune system. So up your vitamin C intake, up your zinc intake, Eat well. Eat, lots of antioxidants. Sleep as much as you can. Obviously, I'm sure we're all sleeping a lot, but rest is super important to immune functioning. Really keeps things in good order. And really watch what you inhale and what you share. I think those are some basic good thoughts that we may be overlooking. And she doesn't say don't use. We all know that cannabis can be very useful for stress, anxiety, obviously sleep, pain, all sorts of conditions. It's not that, but it's used mindfully. Up your edibles. If you have edibles nearby and you like them, use them. You're not irritating the lungs. So that's it. That's it on the health notes. The other bit of news that struck me came from Green Flower Media this week, where they reported, which I didn't realize, that no cannabis businesses are eligible for American Small Business Administration loans, which is really tough. Really tough. It's coming at a bad time, and obviously it's federally illegal, so they're not going to be funding it. But it's really it's really an outrage, isn't it?
Yeah, it's tough, right? Because you do get this sort of good side to the situation in that in a lot of states where it has been legalized, dispensaries are being deemed as being like necessary, so they're allowed to stay open, which is great, because then you're helping a lot of small businesses because they're still allowed to make revenue and income. But yeah, the fact that it's still federally illegal, so therefore, if you do have to close, maybe you're a package manufacturer or something tertiary to the market, like that's going to be a really hard blow to recover from.
It's really going to be hard because there's no recognition of the legality of this business on a national level.
Yeah, I wonder what people will be able to ultimately do in that regard. Obviously, we're reading the Green Flower article. It says that people are remaining optimistic, but doesn't really give a lot of information as to how people might be able to activate and get some changes in the results.
Well, it makes me think we should go back to some of the people we've spoken to. The guys that make Go Fire vaporizers, they were releasing in February. Our friend Michael Backus, who created the perfect, the terpene activated blends, he released in March. He opened his business. I'm wondering how they're doing. Maybe we should go back and talk to them and find out. I think it might be a good idea. I want to know how they're doing and how they're faring.
Well, hopefully.
And I also want to go on.
I was just going to say, hopefully it doesn't create some sort of like power void to where now some big slush of cash can come in and just buy up a ton of these things and unify that way. That would be unfortunate.
I'm not sure. We're going to have to find out, do a little work.
Listeners, I want to personally thank you all. The Brave New Weed podcast is now bigger and more popular and more widely consumed than ever before. And that's because of all of you. But we don't want to stall out now, and we want to continue to grow. So we have one simple ask. If you love the show, share it with one other person who you may know, who may benefit, or has a curiosity and just wants to learn more. Your act of sharing with just one person can help us continue to grow, and by that growth, continue to bring you all of the best news, commentary, interviews, features, and more right here on the Brave New Weed podcast.
I want to also thank our Patreon supporters before we do anything. It's been great to have your support. You're really helping us keep going. It means everything to us. I don't thank you live often because we count on your support regularly. It really means a lot. Thank you. And I also want to say that this episode is special. This is a live recording with Dan Herrer. Dan is Jack Herrer's son. Jack Herer wrote the book, The Emperor Wears No Clothes. Matthew, have you ever read this book?
I know of the book. I've seen like micro documentary versions of it portrayed on video form, but I've never actually read a copy of the book. No.
Well, getting the book now would cost you somewhere between $70 and $300. It's been out of print. It was first published in 1985. Let me step back. And it became very quickly a classic book on cannabis because this guy, Jack Herer, who was a former military guy, discovered the government's propaganda and lies about cannabis quite late in his life, and decided to really dive in deep, and did really the first full-scale exposition of what has happened over the last 80 years. And it really led the way for activism. I believe it laid the foundation for the legalization in California movement that came about a decade later in the 1990s. Anyway, it was a seminal book. 700,000 copies have been printed and bought. But it's been out of print for a while. So Dan, along with another guy named Bruce Dietzen, who has built his own car out of hemp, as a matter of fact, got together and they created a digital version of this book. And it's a fabulous thing. It has all sorts of live links. It becomes a multimedia experience as a digital property. So you can actually go back and see some of the old propaganda films that the government was making in the 1930s and 40s. You can find old artifacts and get links to articles. It's a really live, really alive, I should say, document. And it's coming out. It's out now from Amazon for $9.99. I tried to get him to give some promos to us. As his favorite podcast. But because it's published on Amazon, they don't have the ability to do that.
I see.
I think, I spent $9.99 on it, and I think it's great value. And the reason we're using this as our 420 episode is I think it's good company. If you guys are going to be spending time in solitude or in quarantine, as Matthew and I are, this is a great diversion. And it really is historical look back. And I think in a way it's quite inspiring. So I'm very happy to have Dan on the show. He talked to me very personally, as much as he could, about his dad. You're going to hear some new what's the word? I can't say it. Reminiscences. And you'll learn a lot about Jack Herer. So this is our interview with Dan Herer. This is our special 420 gift to our listeners. And for those of them who don't know, I want to introduce you quickly as the son of the late Jack Herer, who was the author of The Emperor Wears No Clothes, which I would say is the seminal book on cannabis in the 20th century. How would you describe your dad's book?
Well, for me, life-changing. For the rest of the folks that have come to know it and read it, I would say inspirational and really a catalyst for today's cannabis revolution, not just in the United States, but around the globe.
So the reason we're speaking today is that you have, I want to just tell the listeners that you have created a digital version of this classic book, which is now available on Amazon. And it's pretty amazing because it's almost like a documentary, a multimedia sensory experience. It has a gazillion links to a lot of the stories the original book has. But before we go into that, I'd like you to tell us how old you were and what it was like when this book first came out for you. Set us in time and in space, please. Let's go back a bit, okay?
Well, go back a bit. My father, first and foremost, in the first 30 years of his life, was not a cannabis enthusiast on any level.
No kidding. What did he do? What was his profession? Tell me about that.
He started off as a sign painter and as he fixed neon signs back in the 60s and early 70s. But prior to that, he was a military MP in the Korean conflict, and he had a very different view of cannabis and what its relationship was to this country and to humanity. He thought that cannabis, or in those days marijuana, was exactly what he had learned from prohibition, from every anti-cannabis or anti-marijuana propaganda, anything. So reefer madness, what the government would talk to anybody about with regards to this plant being dangerous, he believed it all. And during the 1960s, he really felt that this was the most evil plant on the planet because that's what he was told, and that folks during the Vietnam War who were protesting against the war, and that were also marijuana hippies and counterculturists. In the time where he was uneducated, he thought that they were very un-American and unpatriotic, and they should be taken out and summarily shot.
So what changed? What changed for him?
What changed for my father was he and my mother got divorced. He then caught my mother smoking cannabis in her apartment that she shared with me and my two brothers, and thought that he was at the point where he was going to have to turn my mother into the police because she was breaking the law.
Oh my God.
At the same time, he had moved into an apartment building in the San Fernando Valley, where he brought us in the mid 1960s. And it turned out that in that apartment building were also a bunch of hippies that he didn't realize that when he moved in were there. And there was a young lady that was there that he confided in that he was going to have to turn my mother in for smoking cannabis. And she said, "Jack, you just don't understand. It's not what you think it is." And she persuaded him not to file any charges or to turn her in. And at the same time, she said, "Jack, the only way you're really going to understand this is if you smoke marijuana." And he couldn't. He couldn't bring himself to do that. But what he did do is develop a friendship with her, and then he wanted to date her. And she said, "Jack, you're just too square. I can't see you. And if you wanna go out, if you want to spend time with me, you're gonna have to enlighten yourself." And so she convinced him that he needed to smoke cannabis. And literally, they say a leopard can't change its spots. Well, when my father smoked cannabis for the first time, he literally changed his spots.
I would say that night the emperor had no clothes.
That night the emperor wore no clothes.
As a matter of fact.
So
the rest is history.
Well, in a sense, it was. And so she got him to engage in cannabis, and everything that he had ever been taught or learned or heard about it from the channels that he had for higher learning, no pun intended, that everything was wrong, that the experience that he had was completely contrary to anything that he had ever heard. He didn't go crazy.
Like everybody, he had the same experience as everybody.
Yeah, so there
really,
was this enlightening moment. And my father was a very patriotic man. He was all about the government, and that the United States government was the best and most truthful and most honest and most upstanding government anywhere on the planet, because he stood up for it and he fought for it. And that there was no way that this government or its entities that support this government would ever lie to him or the American people. And when he found out
those dreams were crushed quickly.
and as he began to understand that everything that he had learned was wrong, and my father being such a ravenous reader, I mean, he would read anything and everything, and he had never known any of the things that he was just now starting to learn. So he started to educate himself. And through the next 15 years, he just absorbed everything. He didn't go back into the history books that were written in the 1930s or 40s or 50s or 60s. He went into the history books in the 1800s, 1700s, 1600s, in the 1500s, into other cultures, into other countries, and really started understanding how cannabis was not only necessary. It was the most important crop in any emerging country or commercial endeavor anywhere in the world. Cannabis was part of that evolution of global commodities. And
so let's speak a little more. Let's speak personally for a second. How old were you when the book came out? And was it 1985?
It was 1985. 1985, I was already 23 years old.
You were 23. So you watched your father go through this evolution?
Oh yeah, I was 10 years old, 1972, when I first became aware that my father was interested in cannabis or marijuana, and then I started learning about it when I was 10 in 1972, because that year my father wrote his very first book called Grass, which was it was called The Great Revolutionary American Standard System, and basically it was a grading document on how to determine what kind of pot you were buying and how much you should pay for it, and then if you smoked it, what your high should be. So it gave you all of these examples of how to commoditize what you had, how to enjoy what you had, how to understand what you had. And the thing that attracted me to that as a 10-year-old is my father wrote this book in animation form. So all of the characters on all of the pages were all drawn in the sort of furry Freak Brothers comic stylings, and that became my coloring book as a child. So my father was talking about cannabis, and I was, taking my colored markers and coloring in this book, and I was coloring in folks that were smoking pot and enjoying being high, and showing what they would look like if they got stoned, and all of the descriptions of what those elevation levels were. And so that's how I started to understand about cannabis. So I never was really afraid of it, because hey, how could you be afraid of something that you color? And
it was your coloring book. Yeah. When did you begin to use cannabis, if you even did? I presume you did.
I did. I started experimenting at the age of about 12, without my father's knowledge or understanding. And then, by the time I was 14, he knew I was smoking cannabis. By the time I was in, when I was in high school, I was just one of those kids who was, engaging on a daily basis with his friends.
You were just one of those kids.
I was just
basically.
one of those kids.
Or just one of us kids,
right.
Really. And so what was he a cranky guy, your father? Was he... So I never imagined him as like an easygoing, just relaxed, chill guy for some reason.
Well,
tell me how you would characterize his personality.
Like any father, he had his moments, and he could be quite angry at times, and he could be, incredibly loving and gentle and just incredible. And he always wanted to share his enthusiasm for life and its opportunities and possibilities, from food to art to just being able to experience certain things, whether it was going on road trips with my father or enjoying books on tape with my dad. And this would have been throughout my life. And
was it like, so I remember coming home and my father mixing a drink. I remember him coming home and mixing a drink. Do you remember coming home and your father just rolling a spliff or hitting a bong?
No, never.
No.
That wasn't really in my early adolescence. That was not part of my understanding of my father. He didn't openly engage in cannabis in front of me until I was probably mid-teens to late teens. And
interesting,
but we also had a manufacturing company back in the day where we manufactured paraphernalia for the consumption,
like rolling papers and bongs and pipes.
Well,
like what?
Have you ever seen? Have you ever seen those security cans where the bottom of a right guard can or a WD-40 would unscrew and it would become something you could put your stash in?
No, I never did actually, but I got it.
They were called Canasafes, and it was like a Right Card can or a WD-40 or a Coca-Cola can, and the bottom would unscrew, and you would be able to put your stash in the bottom. And we made a variety of those in the early 1970s through the 1980s, where we gave people a product that they could travel in safety or have something in their home that would be possibly overlooked through a search.
I'm feeling that you should maybe reissue those. It might be time for a nostalgia moment like those.
We sold that company to somebody else, and those products are literally sold around the world right now. I've seen them from Amsterdam to the shelves of Home Depot.
Oh, wow. Well, maybe there's some new products that you can put out there. I think it's a great idea. It sounds really funny. So when the book came out in 1985, you were in your 20s.
Yeah.
I don't have any idea. I mean, I was completely unaware of this book.
Right.
So when it came out, did it cause a sensation, or was it, a great gap of silence when it came out?
No.
What was the response?
It ignited the cannabis movement. And, the funny thing about the book is this was during the Ronald Reagan's, war on drugs and the Just Say No program through Nancy Reagan. And it's so funny that the genesis of this book was literally out of the fact that Ronald Reagan became president and had seen these marijuana protesters on the lawn of the Federal Building in 1980. We were collecting signatures at the time for the California Marijuana Initiative 1980 in Westwood Village, California, and we were on the grass of the U.S. Federal Building. And Ronald Reagan had been elected president, and he was supposedly on his way to his inaugural haircut, which included a stop by the Federal Building. And he saw all these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of protesters out on the lawn of the Federal Building and protesting. And he asked the security at the building as the motorcade pulled up after his election. And he was greeted, hello, Mr. President, how are you? And he was overheard to have said, what's happening out here? Why are the Canadians so upset with us that they would be protesting on the Federal Building lawn? And he said, Mr. President, those aren't Canadians, those are marijuana protesters. And apparently he had mistaken the cannabis leaf for the maple leaf. And it was like, well,
that sounds so right. I'm sure that's so true.
So he was then overheard to have said, well, can't we do anything about it? And they said, no, they had taken us to court and they have the right to be here as American citizens. And he said, well, I'm going to be sworn in as president in the next couple of weeks. Let me see what I can do. And shortly after that, my father and a few other protesters were arrested at night for collecting signatures and registering voters to vote. And when the officers came to arrest my father and the protesters, my father said, "Why are we being arrested? Why, And the officer said, "Well, you're in violation of the Sedition Act." Now, my father, being a military MP, knew what the Sedition Act was, and which says that in times of war, that you're not allowed to occupy federal property after dark. And my father repeated to the officer, "Well, we're not at war." And in 1980, we weren't at war with anybody. And the officer poked my father in the chest and said, "We're at war with you." And my father was arrested. They were issued citations. The government thought that they would just pay the citations and go away. Well, they didn't know my father. The citation was for $5 and go on your way. The other protesters paid the $5 because they didn't want to go to court. And my father said, basically, fuck you and the horse you rode in on. I'm not paying this. I'm an American. I have the right to be here. I have the right to collect signatures. I have the right to register voters. And over the next 3 years, he went through all of the appellate courts in the state of California, and finally was sentenced to federal prison in Terminal Island, California, for registering voters to vote in violation of the Sedition Act.
And he went to jail?
And he went to jail.
For how long?
He was there only for 15 days.
That's enough for registering voters. I think that's enough time for that.
I think it was absolutely absurd, and that was.
I knew he wasn't an easy guy. I knew it. I mean, you can't write that.
But he was principled.
No, and principled means you're going to stand up for what you believe. And if you read "The Emperor Has No Clothes," you know that it's written with a great force. It feels like it was propelled out of his pen.
Well, if you're talking about the force as being truth, without question. And so here's the thing, and I think in a sense Ronald Reagan and the war on drugs for this document. And while my father was in jail, he had, for the first time since he started smoking cannabis, he had time to himself. He didn't have anywhere to go. He didn't have anywhere to go eat. He was stuck in jail. And what is he going to do? My father, being a writer, said, send me some paper, send me something to write with. I want to put some of my thoughts down. And while my father was in jail, he decided to write down his thoughts on cannabis and the history that he understood. So he literally outlined what would become The Emperor Wears No Clothes in Terminal Island Prison, sent there in a sense by Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan and that administration have a lot to do with the genesis of why this book was written when it was. And in 1985, it was published in paperback for the first time. And when this was the first time in history, in our history, that looking at cannabis, and in this case, the truth of cannabis, not the narrative that had been taught to us since 1937, or any time during the Prohibition or the denial era of cannabis. This was the first time that we had the ability to look at true history, documented actually, by this government prior to to Prohibition and throughout the civilizations around the world that had created commodities and commerce and communities based on cannabis. And this was a glaring siren, a ringing bell for people to look at, and all of the things that they ever understood or experienced because of cannabis now were validated. And for the first time, they were able to stand up and in a loud, confident voice, be able to state the truth of cannabis and demand that we have this access. And at the time,
so he got wider. He also was talking about hemp. I mean, I remember.
Well, it's the same thing.
Looking at it, yeah, but he also talked about the fact that I think Ford Motors built a hemp car. Isn't that true?
He built a car using
Henry Ford. Henry Ford did,
in
right?
1939 to 1941 was developing new polymers, new plastics, new technologies to employ in the manufacturing of automobiles, and some of that was to help create a biomass structure for the car, that the body of this car was 10 times stronger than that of steel. And obviously, being a biomass product, it was better for the environment. And Henry Ford recognized this, and he realized that biofuels and bioproducts were better than the alternatives, or that what became the primary components of automobiles. And this is one of the things that my father brought to light. And when people start seeing how history has been manipulated, or in this case erased, where all of these benefits of cannabis and biomass, whether it's hemp or marijuana, have all been distorted and maligned throughout decades and decades of
just malignment, basically.
Yeah,
yes.
when the lies and the falsehoods to create a narrative that we all learn, and they become our vernacular, they become what it is. Our curriculums in school are, that are based around cannabis or hemp, are all erased, and the government and industry for the last 80 years literally erased that history. So
your writing partner in this book is His name is Bruce Eckfield. Do I have it correct?
Bruce Dietzen.
Oh, not even close. Bruce Dietzen. He owns a hemp car, does he not?
Not only he owns it, he created it.
Oh, really? Have you ever ridden in it?
I have not ridden it. I've seen it. It's been on Jay Leno's garage, and Jay Leno has driven in it and did a nice story on it, and they went for a nice drive together. But his car is really something else, and it's a tribute to when you have the ability to develop technologies using cannabis and or hemp to deliver a new product and a new understanding and new possibilities for mankind, that the opportunities to create products that will change our lives well into the future can be found. And
my understanding is that other car manufacturers still use hemp to create car doors. I cannot remember. Was it Mercedes?
It's not still used. They started using. So in 2002, BMW started using hemp technologies in some of their interior component products. In 2008, 2009. Mercedes started taking a larger role into manufacturing door panels, center console pieces, floors, different products for their seats and dashes, and it's to the tune of hundreds of different parts between all of these automobile manufacturers. Now today, it goes into Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Lamborghini, not Lamborghini.
There is that other one. What is the other one?
And all of these car manufacturers, they make products that are using this biomass, but they don't talk about it. So still, even though cannabis and these hemp products are becoming part of our everyday car, we don't know about it as a society. BMW and Mercedes commercials on TVs are not talking about how much better they are for the environment because of hemp. This is still not something that's talked about.
Cars and being better for the environment at this point, that is not a great sales point, I must say.
Well,
they have a ways to go at this point.
But the thing is giving people an understanding that these parts can be made alternatively to those that are far more destructive to our soil, our air, and our environment. Are something that we should be applauding and should be exploring at every level to its full utility.
Totally agree, 100%. Hard to disagree with that, really. So what possessed you to want to reissue the digital edition of The Emperor Wears No Clothes?
Well, I think it comes down to this. In 1985, when this book came out, and it really created an explosion of understanding and activism around this plant. Hemp products started showing up on shelves in the late 1980s with regards to clothing and shampoos and things like that. But as the last 25, 30 years have gone by, we've been less focused on the history of cannabis and have less of an understanding of its possibilities than we did in the 80s and 90s. And that's because we've had access to cannabis, but we've had access to cannabis for the most part only through medicine and only through recreational. And most people, most of the young adults that are growing up today have grown up with access to cannabis, so they weren't really there on the front lines of fighting for its legalization, fighting for its access in their community, fighting for its understanding from a political standpoint of not being harmful and not being dangerous. And so, when I talk to people today about the history of cannabis and why it's so important and why we need to use it to its full utility, they tell me, they're like, "Oh, well, you're preaching to the choir." And to some degree, they might be the choir, but the reality is, in this choir, not all of the choir knows the songs. and it's a really important, and it's not to badmouth anybody, and it's not to point fingers, but the reality is that in many cases we're a lazy society, and if it's just not available, easily and at the tip of a finger, like, hey, I'm going to go on YouTube, or I'm going to go into Amazon, or I'm going to go into whatever and find this information. If it's not available right now on demand, that people are just like, I'm going to go on with what I have access to and not really worry about anything else. And
so, Dan, what's new about the book? Can you give me some of the attributes that you've been able to infuse into the book as a result of digital technology?
Well, with digital technology comes access at the click of a button. And what we've done is we've taken this book in its digital format and made it, in a sense, interactive. So as you're looking at the beginning of this book and you're trying to understand for the first time, if you've known Jack Herer as a genetic that you smoked but didn't understand that he was a man, that at the beginning of this book, it starts talking about my father. There's a hyperlink there. You click on that hyperlink and it takes you to a 1-hour documentary made about his life and the evolution of cannabis and the fight for it. And then as you go through the book and it goes through whatever the topic is, whether it's, manufacturing of paper, medicines, automobile parts, clothing, health and wellness products, all of these chapters, all of these stories throughout the book now have these hyperlinks that as you're reading about 1942 and the U.S. government legalizing cannabis for the war effort and actually making a propaganda film called Hemp for Victory, that there's a hyperlink there. You click on that hyperlink and it takes you right to the 14-minute video that the U.S. government, for the first time in a very long time, told the truth about how absolutely vitally important this cannabis plant was. And as soon as the war was over, not only did they pull the program from American farmers, they denied that they even made the film that promoted the propaganda that farmers should grow cannabis for the war effort and help win the war for the American country and our allies. And it's just so funny how our history can be as easily erased as it has been created. And with this book, now it being interactive, when you're reading about stories of the past, you hit the hyperlink and it takes you to stories of today and the opportunities of tomorrow. So it really gives you a sense of having a living document in a way that it's not like, oh, I'm just reading this history book. It's like, oh my God, they were talking about this 80 years ago, and here we are today, and we're making products that are doing these exact things before we even knew we could create these products, before we even knew that there was a digital printing of cannabis products, or making automobiles that were more degradable and efficient and more eco friendly than everything that we've ever learned, before we knew that an acre of hemp grown for the manufacturing of paper was equal to 4 acres of trees. So that we didn't have to do deforestation. We didn't have to destroy our planet in order to have the things that we enjoy today. That all of these technologies that are employed today through the synthetic cycle could have been done and built and developed through the use of hemp if we only embraced it at the time that we started really understanding its possibilities. And
what was your thank you. What was your favorite, or what should I say? What was the most surprising, let's say, digital asset you discovered in recreating and digitizing the book?
I think just making it come alive. Making this book not just speak to you from a sense of what you're seeing with your own eyes, but really being able to speak to you about if we knew that these things could have happened back in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, but we didn't have the technology, and now these technology exists, I think that the opportunities, the light bulbs that go off in our head, that my father only dreamed of when he was writing this book, and now are becoming realities, to this new.
Was there not one favorite movie? Was there not one favorite, I don't know, digital photograph or document that you were able to put into the book that really stood out to you and went, boy, doing
for me,
amazing?
I think in 1914, the U.S. government printed a $10 note. And, when we think about this country, when we think about, who it is and what we are, for the most part, we are an economic power. We are a commodity-based, society. We are about money and riches and on so many levels. That seems to be our focus now. It may not have always been that. But to know that our government at one point in history printed a $10 bill on
the
hemp.
symbol of what was to become uber capitalism, printed it on hemp.
Yeah, they printed it on hemp. But not only did they print it on hemp, on the back of this $10 bill, it depicts cannabis farming in America. And here's my thought, as when I think about this, our currency represents who we are in many ways. It looks at our founding fathers, whether it's Washington or Lincoln or Jefferson or great, fighters or, warriors like Ulysses S. Grant. It talks about these people that were instrumental in helping to create this country. And then at the same time, it depicts, monuments dedicated to these individuals or ideas about who we are as Americans. So our American dollar says who we are. We print it and say, this is who we are. And in 1914, the United States government depicts cannabis farming on the back of a currency that represents this country and its importance. I can guarantee.
And I believe that 1914 was maybe the first state that enacted prohibition.
It was.
I'm not positive of that.
It was the very first state also started looking at cannabis because it was long thought to if you were consuming cannabis as an individual in the turn of the century, that if you were a Mexican or a black youth or a black musician, or if there was any, if you were smoking cannabis, that it made you feel equal to people who were, at that time, very, very racist. And they didn't want you looking at them in the eye. They didn't want you walking on their shadows. They didn't want you looking at their family or at their wives or at their daughters. And if you smoked cannabis, you felt equal to that, and you were not allowed to. So there was this demonization through, the propaganda films and
prohibition and prohibiting it.
And that all didn't start at 1937. It started long before 1937, as far as these negative stories. And these negative stories were born out of prejudice, racism, and greed. And
that's correct. I want to ask you another question, a different topic. So a lot of people today know Jack Herer as a strain of cannabis.
Yes.
What's your relationship to the strain of Jack Herer?
Well, me and my family, after my father passed in 2010, I decided that if my father's name was going to be used within this cannabis space, that it should be used by this family. This was my father. This was our father. This was, this was our legacy. And that if I were going to represent it, if I was going to protect it to the best of my abilities as his son and his heir, that I should then try to figure out how to control that through commercial endeavors. And I started a cannabis company in mid 2015, going into 2016, where cannabis started to become legal, or legal access to cannabis started happening in California. And I asked my family to stand behind me and believe that I would try to make something that we could all be proud of. And so I started a company called The Original Jack Herer. And we've been doing pretty well. and
that controls the genetics of the original variety of Jack Herer.
I'm building a brand. People use a genetic that's similar to ours, and they try to capture and try to utilize my father's name for their benefit, and not necessarily for the benefit of my father's legacy. And we don't sell our genetic. There are genetics out there that are similar in profile, but nothing is as what we grow. And we don't sell our seeds. We don't sell our genetics. We don't sell our clones. We grow them all for this company and for our products. And we stand behind that because for us, to creating a brand with my father at its core, or who my father was and what he stood for and what he fought for the last 40 years of his life, is something that is very personal to me. And to create this company, it's not just selling a genetic; it's selling a promise of what it is and what it stands for, and that it stands for the community of cannabis, not the commodity of cannabis. And
where do you grow it?
We grow it with partner farms throughout California. Our largest farms are in the Salinas Valley.
That's in Southern California.
That is in Southern California. Well,
great.
Central farming area, coastal.
Great. So if people want to partake of the original Jack Herer,
right,
they have to ask for the original Jack Herer. Well, you don't just ask for a Jack Herer strain. Is that correct?
That would be it. If it doesn't say the original Jack Herer, it's just not.
Gotcha. Tell our listeners how to find your book. I mean, we tried to convince you to give us some free downloads for them as promotions, but I understand that is just not possible. So where can people download and find this book, Dan?
Well, right now and future forward, it will be available on Amazon, either basic Amazon or Amazon Prime under the Emperor Wears No Clothes digital book, and it'll show up for the very first time at $9.99 for the copy itself, and that's the interactive copy. Or you could also, choose to get a printed version of the book, and it's on print on demand. So the book will never be out of publication again. And as we continue to develop the digital format of this, it will continue to be a living document future forward. So as new information comes up, as new new truths become evident and really vettable, that will add these other points of truth and light and help to create yet a new opportunity for new generations to have an understanding of how important this plant is. Even more so now than even 30 years ago, we were fighting just not to go to jail for cannabis. But now with the understanding of cannabis and hemp being so broad and so much opportunity, people talk about cannabis and CBD as these great businesses to invest in. But the reality is that everything that we touch as humanity, whether it's papers and plastics and fibers and fuels and all of these different products that can be made with this plant, become more possible. The importance of understanding this plant and its possibilities through this book are really illuminating and inspiring, and we hope that this book being re-released at a time where people are really trying to have an understanding of why is cannabis becoming so important around the world, that people are starting to talk about importing and exporting and creating entire markets in the hundreds of billions of dollars that it could create worldwide. That people need to have an understanding of what this plant is, not just the fact that it could be commoditized, but the fact that it could changed the world.
Dan, how much is the print on demand?
The print on demand version is $34.95.
So when I last, and it's interesting, when I last looked, an old copy of the book, like an older copy, was about $70.
Yeah, anywhere from 70 to multi-hundreds.
Wow, amazing. Hey, listen, I want to thank you for this and for your time. And
my pleasure.
And for your insight and for actually doing the book. I know these things are huge labors of love and huge efforts. I know that this does not happen quickly or easily. So thanks to you and thanks to Bruce, whose name I will never mispronounce again.
I could not have done it without Bruce's insight and determination to get this digital copy done. It was a great collaboration.
I mean, I wish you all the best with it. I've started looking at it on my Kindle the other night, and it's fantastic. And I love seeing all those links. I wish you all the best. Thanks again, Dan, for joining us here at the Brave New Weed podcast.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm humbled to be on your show, Joe. Thank you so much.
Hi, listeners. We are always on the lookout for great things to talk about on the Brave New Weed podcast, and we'd love to hear from you. You can always email us at bravenewweedcast@gmail.com with links to articles, interesting news stories, personal accounts of things that you've done, or leads on books or products that we should know about. You can always contact us at bravenewweedcast@gmail.com. Joe, earlier in the episode, you were talking about those sort of like major revelatory thoughts that can sometimes come to us when you were, talking about your bike ride and that stuff. And, the original The Emperor Wears No Clothes was one of those major revelations that came out and really started people to think and to change things. And I think it's great to see them working to use technology, to use the modern landscape to enrich that experience. And maybe we get to see another mental revolution come to change because of it.
I don't know. We'll see. There's one other thing I want to say, which is that I think it's not like I have survivor guilt, but I have some lucky man guilt. That I have to say, I mean, I feel very lucky to be here talking about bike rides and nature and being able to be in that situation. And I realize that not everybody is nearly as lucky.
Yeah.
And I don't know anyone who's died yet of COVID. I know people who've been infected and who've gotten over it, but I don't know anyone who's lost people. I was talking to my sister on Zoom this morning. She actually knows 3 people who've passed away as a result. So there is a quality of I'm going to call it lucky man or lucky woman guilt that I'm experiencing. And I want to be clear about that. I don't mean to be, trumpeting my good fortune in the face of such bad fortune happening. I also want to say that we had got 2 amazing episodes coming up, Matt. Being here, I've been able to podcast a lot. And our next episode will be with Dr. Julie Holland, who's been on our show a couple of times. Mm-hmm. I wanted to talk about mental health in the post-COVID era. Like, what's going to happen? What are we going to do? Julie's a psychiatrist. She's a cannabis activist. She's a psychedelic supporter, and she knows a lot, and she's extremely bright and extremely well-spoken. That'll be our next episode. Following that, I did an interview with a fantastic molecular biologist who loves plant medicines named Kevin Spellman. I've been working with Kevin on some projects over the last few months, and I really wanted to talk about how we can use plant medicines to strengthen our resilience, strengthen our immune system, strengthen our lives, really, in the age of COVID. So these are 2 upcoming episodes that I want to keep everybody aware of and really encourage you to tune into, because they really enlightened me. I learned so much, and I think that's the point of a podcast like this right now. So thank you for joining me again, Matthew. I hope lockdown ends soon enough, and I hope you're staying well.
Thanks so much, Joe. Happy holidays and stay safe out there, you and everyone else.
And happy 420 to all of our listeners.
Thanks for listening to the Brave New Weed podcast. This episode and all future episodes are made possible by amazing listeners like yourself. If you like what you've heard, we encourage you to show your support by giving $1 a month for special access and rewards on patreon.com/bravenewweed. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram via @BraveNewWeed. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/bravenewweed. And remember, you can always find more information about us or information discussed in each episode by pointing your favorite browser to bravenewweed.com.